All right, so today we're diving deep into the Navy's DDX destroyer program.
Oh, this one is fascinating.
It really is. And, listeners are always asking about potential problems and solutions when it comes to these big defense programs.
As they should.
Exactly. So to help us break it all down, we're taking a close look at this 2004 CRS report for Congress about the DDX program. It captures that moment when there was a ton of excitement for this new destroyer, but also some really serious concerns.
Yeah, it really lays out that tension perfectly.
Let's start with what the DDX was actually supposed to be.
Well, it was a proposed new type of Navy destroyer, basically intended to replace the earlier DD-21 concept.
Right, and it was being designed with a focus on multi-mission capability, especially for land attack, right?
Absolutely. The firepower they were planning was pretty mind-blowing.
Wow.
255-millimeter advanced gun systems, over 600 shells, 80 missile tubes for Tomahawk cruise missiles, and who knows what else they had in mind.
Sounds like a floating arsenal.
It kind of was, and here's the thing that always gets me. They were aiming for a crew of just 125 to 175 sailors.
Wow, that's tiny compared to the 300 plus on existing destroyers and cruisers.
Right. They figured that smaller crew would mean lower operating costs over the ship's lifetime, but, well, building this technological marvel was going to be expensive. The Navy initially estimated the cost of the first DDX at $2.8 billion, with later ships coming in at $1.2 to $1.4 billion each. And remember, those are FY 2002 dollars.
Okay, but I'm guessing those numbers didn't tell the whole story.
Not quite. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, had a different take. They projected a higher average cost, about $1.8 billion per ship, in FY 2003 dollars for a class of 24 DDX destroyers.
That's a pretty significant difference.
It is, and it's not just about the sticker price either. When you compare the cost per 1,000 tons of light ship displacement, a way to compare ships of different sizes, the Navy's estimate made the DDX seem like a bargain compared to the existing DDG-51 destroyers.
I see, so it made the DDX look good on paper.
Yeah, but if you use the CBO's numbers, which historically have been more accurate, that advantage basically disappears. It raised a lot of concerns about potential cost overruns for the program.
So basically the CBO was saying, hold on, this might not be as affordable as you're making it sound.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the Navy didn't really offer a detailed explanation for their cost projections, which only made those concerns from Congress and watchdog groups even louder.
Okay, so we've got cost concerns swirling around this program. But what about the technology itself? Was it all actually ready for prime time?
That's a great question. The DDX was packed with all these cutting-edge systems, but there were definitely questions about whether they were mature enough.
So how did the Navy try to address those technological challenges?
Well, they definitely recognized the risks. They invested in land-based engineering design models and pumped more money into development. They were trying to mitigate the risks as much as they could.
Sounds like they were taking it seriously. Did those efforts satisfy the GAO, though?
It's not entirely. A 2004 GAO report pointed out a pretty big problem. The program schedule was just way too rushed. It didn't give those new technologies enough time to mature before the Navy needed to make major design decisions.
So it sounds like they were trying to build a ship of the future with technology that wasn't quite ready for the present.
That's a good way to put it. And the GAO report provided some specific examples.
Like what?
Well, there was the dual-band radar. They decided to change the type of radar mid-program, which, as you can imagine, caused some major delays. And then there was the integrated power system. It ended up being much heavier than they anticipated, which impacted the ship's overall design.
I see. Those sound like some pretty big headaches.
They were, and these were just two examples. The GAO report actually highlighted that 8 out of 10 key subsystems didn't have any fallback options.
So if those unproven technologies failed, they were kind of stuck.
Pretty much.
That seems incredibly risky. All right, so we've got cost concerns and technology uncertainties. Now let's shift gears a bit. What about the DDX's intended role in naval surface fire support, or NSFS? Was all that firepower really necessary?
Well, the thinking was that those two 155-millimeter advanced gun systems were meant to fill the gap left by the retirement of those Iowa-class battleships back in the early 1990s.
Right, so the Navy was trying to regain that ability to provide heavy firepower from offshore.
Exactly. And supporters of the DDX really emphasized that NSFS was crucial. They pointed to places like the Korean Peninsula, where those geographic challenges make sustained fire support from ships really important.
Okay, that makes sense given the Navy's focus on sea control. But were there people who disagreed with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. Skeptics argued that recent conflicts in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq showed a different reality. Those operations really highlighted how effective air power and precision-guided munitions could be in supporting ground troops.
So they were questioning whether a ship like the DDX, designed for heavy bombardment, was really the best approach in a world that seemed to be moving towards more precise and agile warfare.
Exactly. They were saying, hold on, is this really the best way to allocate resources and firepower?
It sounds like a classic debate between traditional approaches and adapting to new realities.
It really was. And this debate about the role of NSFS was just one piece of the puzzle when it came to evaluating the DDX program.
Okay, so we've got this debate about the role of NSFS, but even if we set that aside for a moment, there was still the issue of how the Navy was actually planning to pay for the DDX.
Right. The funding strategy was definitely a point of contention.
They wanted to use the research and development account to fund the lead ship instead of the typical ship construction account, right?
Yeah, the SCN account. And that raised a lot of eyebrows.
I bet. What were people concerned about?
Well, critics argued that using the R&D account could hide the real cost of building the DDX.
Yo, a lack of transparency.
Exactly. And it could weaken congressional oversight, too, because it went against the usual full funding policy for defense procurement.
So it's basically a way to potentially bypass those normal budgetary checks and balances.
That's what some folks were worried about. It added another layer of complexity to an already controversial program.
Right. So on top of the cost concerns and the technology questions, you've got these potential transparency issues as well. And then there's the impact on the shipbuilding industrial base. Switching from building DDG-51s to these new DDX destroyers was bound to have some ripple effects.
Oh, absolutely. The FY 2006 budget didn't include any funding for large surface combatant procurement, at least according to the Future Years Defense Program, or FYDP.
So what would that have meant for the shipyards and the workforce?
Well, it raised serious concerns about maintaining that skilled workforce and keeping those shipyards running at full capacity.
Right, because if the DDX faced delays or procurement was slowed down, it could have had a domino effect on the whole industry.
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act.
Okay, so we've laid out a lot of problems here. But what about solutions? Surely there were people brainstorming ways to address all these challenges.
Oh, yeah. There were tons of ideas being thrown around.
Like what were some of the options?
Well, you had everything from minor tweaks to the program all the way to completely scrapping it and starting from scratch.
So the full spectrum of possibilities.
Yep. Some people thought the Navy's plan was solid and we should just approve it as is and trust their projections.
Hope for the best.
Pretty much. Others thought the whole thing was too risky and we should just cut our losses and walk away.
But I'm guessing there were some middle ground options too.
Definitely. One idea was to move the procurement for that lead, DDX, from the research and development account back to the SCN account, the regular shipbuilding budget.
Bring it back under that traditional oversight.
Right. That way it'd be more transparent and subject to those usual budgetary checks and balances.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other ideas?
Another suggestion was to just hit pause on the whole thing. Defer procurement for a while.
Give them some breathing room.
Exactly. That way, those critical technologies would have more time to mature and they could do a more thorough analysis of the costs.
Take a step back and really assess the situation. Sounds reasonable. Were there any other options being floated?
Oh, yeah. A lot of folks focused on adjusting that procurement rate. Some argued for building 3 ships every year.
To try and bring that per unit cost down.
Right. But others thought we should scale back to maybe 1 or 1.5 ships per year.
To ease the pressure on the budget.
Exactly. It was all about finding that sweet spot, Balancing capability, affordability, and risk.
Right, because you can't have it all.
Unfortunately not. And then some people were thinking even further outside the box, looking beyond the DDX itself.
Okay, like what? What were they suggesting?
Well, one idea was to give the shipbuilding industrial base some other projects to work on, just to make sure there wouldn't be any gaps in production.
Keep those shipyards humming and those workers employed.
Exactly. Someone even suggested looking at the Coast Guard's Deepwater Cutter program as a way to bridge that gap.
Interesting. So using other projects to kind of smooth out the bumps in the DDX timeline.
Precisely. It was a clever way to address those industrial-based concerns without actually changing the DDX program itself.
Right. So what about those truly outside-the-box ideas? Anyone suggesting completely ditching the DDX and going in a different direction?
Oh, yeah. There were definitely a few of those floating around. Some folks thought we should just start from scratch with entirely new ship designs.
Wow, a clean slate approach. What kind of designs were they envisioning?
Well, one concept was a purpose-built, low-cost NSFS ship. Basically, a ship laser-focused on providing fire support without all the bells and whistles of the DDX.
So a more affordable and specialized option.
Right. And then there was the idea of a new design frigate.
A frigate, how would that fit in?
Well, some people thought a frigate could handle a lot of the missions that the DDX was supposed to perform. But without those super expensive and controversial advanced gun systems.
Interesting. So it'd be a more versatile platform, but without that heavy firepower.
Exactly. And there was actually a 2003 Congressional Budget Office report that had already explored this frigate alternative.
So it wasn't just a random idea. There was some analysis behind it.
Right. And it was starting to gain some traction as a potential path forward.
Okay, so we've got all these different options on the table. But what happened next? Did Congress actually take any concrete action on the DDX program in 2005?
They did. The conference report on the FY 2005 Defense Appropriations Bill actually provided some advanced procurement funding for the DDX.
That they approved funding, even with all those concerns we've been talking about.
Yeah, but it came with some important strings attached.
Like what?
Well, remember how we talked about those concerns over using the research and development account to fund the lead ship?
Right, that transparency issue?
Yeah, well, Congress addressed that head on. They shifted a chunk of the funding over to the SCN account.
So, back to the traditional shipbuilding budget.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure everything was out in the open and subject to those regular oversight procedures.
Okay, so a move toward greater transparency.
Mhm.
Did they address any of the other concerns, though? Like those technological risks?
Oh, absolutely. They included some specific directives that were meant to mitigate those risks.
Tell me more. What kind of directives?
Well, they basically mandated land-based testing for the AGS and the IPS, those advanced gun systems, and the integrated power system. And this testing had to happen before the critical design review could even take place.
So they wanted proof that those systems could actually work before they'd let the program move forward.
Right. The conference report even mentioned how shipbuilding programs historically tend to experience cost overruns when those technological requirements change midstream.
So they were trying to avoid repeating those mistakes.
Exactly. They didn't want the DDX to become another cautionary tale.
I see. So it was a cautious approach. Approve the funding, but with safeguards in place.
You got it. They weren't just rubber stamping the program, they were actively trying to shape its direction.
So what else did they ask the Navy to do?
Well, they requested a detailed report outlining how the Navy was going to transition those key DDX technologies from development to testing, then to acquisition, and finally to installation.
So a roadmap for making sure those technologies were mature enough to be integrated into the ship.
Exactly. And they also specifically asked the Navy to address backup technologies, have some fallback options in case those cutting-edge systems didn't work out as planned.
So they were saying, we'll trust you, but we're going to verify every step of the way.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really interesting.
Oh, how so?
Well, the DDX program, at least as it was initially conceived, never actually came to be.
Wait, what? After all that debate, all those proposed solutions, the DDX just disappeared.
Not exactly disappeared, but it went through a pretty major transformation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, in 2005, the same year as that conference report we were just talking about, the Navy announced that they were restructuring the program. They basically rebranded the DDX as the DDG-1000 Zumwalt class destroyer.
Hold on, so the DDX didn't go away, it just evolved.
You got it.
So what stayed the same and what changed?
Well, the DDG-1000 kept some of the core features from the DDX, like that emphasis on stealth and the integrated power system.
Okay, so some of those key technological innovations carried over. But what about the rest of the design?
That's where things get interesting. The DDG-1000 ended up being smaller than the DDX.
Smaller. I thought the whole point was to build this massive, powerful destroyer.
It was, initially. But as the program evolved, they decided to scale things back. Instead of 255mm advanced gun systems, the DDG-1000 only had one.
So less firepower than originally planned.
Right, and the number of missile tubes got reduced too.
Interesting. What about the mission? Did the Zumwalt class still focus on land attack like the DDX?
That's actually one of the biggest differences. The DDX was all about land attack, but the DDG-1000 was designed to be more of a multi-mission destroyer capable of both land attack and anti-surface warfare.
So they shifted away from that dedicated NSFS role that caused so much debate?
Yep. It seems like they were trying to create a more versatile platform, maybe in response to those changing warfare dynamics we were talking about earlier.
Right, the idea that maybe we didn't need a ship solely focused on bombardment in a world where precision and flexibility were becoming more important. But what about those cost concerns? Did they manage to bring the price tag down?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. The DDG-1000 actually ended up being even more expensive than the DDX was projected to be.
No way. How much did each Zumwalt-class destroyer end up costing?
A whopping $4.24 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Fewer ships, less firepower, and a higher cost.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if all those compromises were really worth it.
It's a good question. And the Zumwalt class has definitely faced its share of challenges and controversies over the years.
Like what? Like what? Fill us in on some of the controversies surrounding the Zumwalt class.
Well, those advanced gun systems, the ones they touted as a key feature, they ran into some big problems.
Oh no, what happened?
The long-range ammunition, the kind that was supposed to give the Zumwalt that real edge for land attack, it turned out to be way too expensive to produce.
You're kidding. So they couldn't even use the ammo that the guns were designed for.
It was a pretty big setback. In the end, the Navy actually decided to abandon the whole idea of using that special ammunition.
Wow, so all that investment in these high-tech guns, and they ended up being, well, not so useful for their intended purpose.
Yeah, it definitely highlighted the risks that come with relying on cutting-edge technology, especially when it hasn't been fully proven in real-world conditions.
It's a good reminder that even with all the planning and testing in the world, things can still go wrong.
Absolutely. So, to answer your earlier question about where the Zumwalt class stands today, well, the Navy only ended up building 3 of them.
Just 3.
Yeah, and they're still trying to figure out exactly how to use them. The role of the Zumwalt class in the fleet is still evolving, you could say.
So after all this, the Zumwalt class is still searching for its purpose.
Kind of, yeah. There's ongoing debate about how to best utilize these ships, especially given their high cost and those limitations with the gun systems. Some people think they should stick to the original land attack mission, even without the fancy ammo.
I see. So maybe focus on targets closer to shore, where the range wouldn't be as much of an issue.
Exactly. But others think they should be repurposed for different missions entirely, like anti-surface warfare or maybe even ballistic missile defense.
Interesting. So maybe they'll end up being more versatile than originally planned, kind of like a jack of all trades.
Possibly. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We started with the DDX program, all that excitement and ambition, and we followed it through cost concerns, technological challenges, and ultimately, a complete transformation into the Zumwalt class. It really shows that defense acquisition is a complex process, to say the least.
No kidding. There's no simple formula for success in this business.
Right, you've got budgetary constraints, you've got these constantly evolving technologies, the strategic landscape is always shifting, and then you're trying to balance capability with affordability. It's a lot to juggle.
It really is. And I think the story of the DDX and the Zumwalt class really highlights the importance of careful planning, rigorous oversight, and maybe most importantly, a willingness to adapt when things don't go according to plan.
Flexibility is key, that's for sure. So any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up this deep dive into the DDX and the Zumwalt class?
Well, I'd say don't let the complexity of it all discourage you. Defense acquisition is a fascinating field full of challenges and opportunities. And by understanding these lessons learned from programs like the one we discussed today, we can hopefully make more informed decisions about the future of our nation's defense.
Absolutely. It's all about learning from the past, both the successes and the setbacks, to make better choices moving forward.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to talk shop.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.